So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second session, and we're going to try again. We got everything in the load shedding sorted out. Luckily, it's stopped for now, so we're very happy about that. So guys, just from our side, again, this is then our final webinar for the School of Financial Planning and Insurance for this year, and we are ending it on a high note with a workshop on ethics. I see there's already a question in the question box. So guys, yes, this session is then registered with the FBI for CPD hours. As soon as the webinar is concluded, we will post a link where you must just please complete a Microsoft form for us, for your details, so we can submit to them. And to sweeten the deal, due to the problems of last week, I've also arranged that the recording, we will add a few multiple choice questions. So once you have watched the recording afterwards, answer a few multiple choice questions. Those will also then be accredited for CPD hour. And so the whole week. So please also then send it to your friends that need the CPD hours. So guys, just a little bit of housekeeping from my side before I introduce our wonderful speaker to you guys. At the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's an ask a question. So you're welcome to post any questions there. If there's any ethical dilemmas or anything that we can maybe assist with, you're welcome to ask it there. And then, like I said, at the end, we will post the link to just complete your name and your surname and the details for today's session. That link will be available till 5 o'clock today. So please get it done before 5 o'clock so you don't miss out and have to go do questions for it as well. Okay, so guys, I want to then introduce you to Resheka. She's been with us for a while now. She's a functional coach, a consultant, a speaker, and a mentor to me. And guys, she's also the co-author of an innovative book, Retail Vision, which was published in 2019. And every time we ask her, can we just get your bio? It just increases and increases. We are so incredibly proud of her, as she is also a Mill Park alumni. She did her MBA with us. So guys, without further ado, I hand you over to Resheka. Thank you so much.
Cool, thank you. Hello, good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you, Marisa. And thank you to the technical team and everyone involved. And sincere apologies to everyone for the technical challenges that we experienced last week. I was as disappointed and probably as frustrated as everyone else was. So thank you for your understanding and patience. So the format of the talk today is on ethics. And I can imagine none of you are exceptionally enthused to be here, and understandably so. It's not an exciting topic, but a very necessary topic. So bear with me. I'm going to cover a few points and then leave enough time for questions, and which we will get to at the end. However, if you do have any questions, you're welcome to post them, and I'm sure Marisa and team will catch them and we will address them as I complete. So let's get into this talk. So let's get a little bit of understanding. You may have heard, some people would say some people are good and some people are just bad. That's all I need to know. Or I just know the right thing to do. Or better still, I've learned everything that I need to know from my parents. Now, if you are thinking along these lines or have heard people say this, this is often some of the comments that people make with regards to ethics in terms of their understanding or all that they need to know about ethics. So indulge me a little bit with this parable. There was once a ruthless king who was pretty feared, as most kings are or used to be in these parables. And he called upon the wise man of his kingdom. And he demanded to know the meaning of life from the wise man. So the wise man had adhered to the request and went along to the king and listened to the king's request. And he immediately wanted to know what was the meaning of life and expected the wise man to answer. So the wise man unfortunately could not answer, and as all wise men do, requested some time. So he requested 24 hours to revert with the answer. The king was obviously annoyed because he felt that his instruction was not met. Nonetheless, he afforded the 24 hours, knowing full well that if he didn't afford the 24 hours, that the chances of getting this answer was going to be delayed or probably prevented, depending on what kind of punishment he had levied against the wise man. So 24 hours had passed, and the wise man returns. And the king excitedly waits for his answer, except there's no answer. The wise man instead requests more time. And in this time, he says he would like another 24 hours because this is a huge question to contemplate. 24 hours later, he returns. This time he asks for a week. Really annoyed and frustrated, but really with no other option, the king affords him the week. A week passes, and the wise man returns, feeling frazzled, but unable to respond, and he asks for a month. Really annoyed and frustrated. Now the king wants to consider punishments and judgments against the wise man, but he also knows that his hands are tied because where else can he get this answer? So to this point, he offers an extension. The wise man returns, and so on and so on, and eventually asks for a year. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this to you is ethics is very much the same because it's an evolving conversation, it's an evolving subject, and it's actually not a new subject. This conversation of ethics has been going on for over 5,000 years and been evolving for over 5,000 years, which is the reason I draw your attention to the parable. Just like the meaning of life, it continues, it changes. It also depends a lot on the meaning that we give to ethics or our understanding of ethics. So on this point of consideration, consider for yourself where you're at and how you answer this, to understand where you're at in terms of your own understanding. So if you were in a particular situation, are you able to forgive without condoning the action? Consider this for yourself, please. We're not looking necessarily for answers, but these are considerations. Are you able to hold a friend accountable and still have a friend? Are you able to speak up in the face of hatred or plain meanness, but still be responsible and respectful? Are you able to put together an ethical bid or request for proposal? Are you able to meet the expectations of the various roles that you play and represent in society, as well as live your personal life by the same guidelines? And most importantly, the question that we all have to ask and consider is, are you able to recognize your own ethical blind spots? So whether you're navigating, sorry guys, I've just realized that I have not put up the slides. Marisa? Sorry. Marisa, are you able to help me? I see that I'm unable to put up the slide.
Yes, just give me a moment. I'll get them up for you now.
Thank you. I'm trying to share. Okay, thank you.
They're coming. My PowerPoint's just taking a bit its time.
Okay. I'm just on the first slide. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, guys. Thank you. Thanks for that, Marisa.
No problem.
Okay. So whether you're navigating your interior landscape with regards to these questions and how you answer them for yourself, whether you're navigating your interior landscape or the wonderful and diverse, vast world that we're living in, how you translate your values and your action defines how far you will go and how satisfied you're going to feel in the journey that you take. Now, it's unlikely that all of us would agree that a specific action counts for the most ethical in a given situation. But this does not mean that we have the license to lie, cheat, or steal. Or for that matter, it more importantly does not mean that it gives us a pass in order to disengage from conversation on ethics. So if, like me, you're looking for the answers to these persistent questions or with regards to ethics, let's delve into this conversation. However, I would like to tell you upfront that it is unlikely that you're going to find all your answers with regards to ethics in this particular talk. What will happen is that you will have plenty to contemplate on to guide you and direct you in terms of what ethics means to you and how to guide your particular ethical decision. The next slide, please, Marisa. So to start this conversation in terms of where do we begin? Okay, we always start with, and if you have come to know me, we always start with, who are you? Who am I? Because that's where the foundation is on everything that we bring into the world or give of ourselves. It starts with who we are and how we have created ourselves. So the very basic question of who are we? So when I ask you, who are we? Am I asking you, where do you spend most of your time? We spend a lot of our time zoning in on our professional excellence or on volunteer work, even parenting for that matter, okay? But these are things that you do where you expend your energy. That is not who you are. Or for that matter, if you're looking at where do you put a lot of effort in? Now we spend a lot of effort on questions. We also spend a lot of effort on collecting things. For example, qualifications, degrees, etc. We expend energy, or we expend energy, for example, on social media sites. Okay, a lot of us spend energy on Facebook, or should I now say meta pages, or for that matter, it might be an external activity, like, for example, gardening. A lot of people like manicured lawns. Now we put a lot of effort into the outside world, but does that answer who are we? The reason that I'm zoning in on this is that if we aren't aware of our identity, then we aren't aware that our identity is shaping the ethics, shaping our particular ethics, and shaping how we are perceived in terms of ethical evaluation by the outside world. So our everyday ethics is actually what determines who we are and how we are perceived. Values, for that matter, are universal. Okay, each one of us has a particularly unique fingerprint with regards to values. We decide what we are going to take as priority in our life, what we're going to view as important, what choices we're going to make, how we're going to see the world, how we're going to interpret it, and most importantly, what stories we are going to tell about the things that we see and interpret is going to determine who we are and how we define ourselves. So our ethical self is shaped continuously by the myriad of choices that we make on a daily basis. Things that we don't necessarily seem to think that we are making ethical decisions about because they're just everyday stuff, but that actually are what our philosophers call our character and which forms our ethical selves. Our next slide, please, Marisa. So if you aren't aware of this and you want to become friends with your ethical self, okay, there's a couple of strategies that we can follow to do this. The first strategy is to pay attention, not just to the things around you, but pay attention to what is inside of you. So for example, What do you care about? And why do you care about those things? What are your passions? What triggers your most unethical self to come out as opposed to your best self? Become familiar with such situations and occasions. Be mindful then of the conversation that you have with yourself and with others when such matters arise. Such as, how are you showing up in the world? How are you showing up in your communities? What are the things that you would like to improve and change about yourself? What actions are you taking in that direction? These all speak to ethics and keeping promises to ourselves. Where would you begin with this in terms of being your best self? When we start asking these questions about ourselves, we then get an opportunity to start making discerning choices. As opposed to going to default choices that were made mostly for us, or that was decided for us, that we have found ourselves flowing into but aren't aware of. Now, often this is where we often get stuck, because we come up with lots of options being presented to us. And if, like me, most of you might find that you're overwhelmed. And when we're overwhelmed, we aren't necessarily aware or cannot see what's best for us, or aren't able to make discerning choices. So this is where, more often than not, we feel stuck, and when we make no decision. So when this happens, be aware if you're feeling overwhelmed or if you're feeling stuck, because this is an opportunity to start making different choices and decisions. So we start with our ethical self. We start with our good self, with our values, our commitments. What are the gifts of ourselves that we can give to ourselves and to all whom we engage with? Now, these are often pretty straightforward to find. If we aren't able to find on our side or with our own introspection, this is often where we can get feedback from people we work with and our significant and intimate people in our lives. However, the more difficult aspect is to find our sides that we're not so happy with. The more difficult conversation is the self-confrontation, or what is also known as the shadow side. Next slide, please, Marisa. So the shadow side, which you may have heard of, this particular term was made popular by Carl Jung, okay? And he saw it as the uncivilized side, also known as the primitive side of ourselves or of our nature. He believed that we needed to fully see this dark side of ourselves if we were to become fully integrated humans. However, according to psychology, psychology says that the shadow side of ourselves contains the personality or the parts of ourselves that we don't want to admit to having. Now, the thing is, we all have this. We all have sides that we project and that we want to see visible and we want to be known as or seen as. And there's also aspects of us that we aren't necessarily happy or proud of and that we'd like to hide. Now, that's not often the case, because this side of ourselves is triggered and does show up when we don't know ourselves or know how to handle ourselves. Now, in terms of ethics, we can contemplate on these questions or ask ourselves these questions to see where this might come up. So, for example, ask yourself, where is it that you can possibly be tempted? Or where do I fall off the ethical rail? Or where am I not showing up as I want to show up? And this can be in any aspect of our life. And the reason we contemplate on this question in a broader perspective is if we're feeling this in one aspect of our life, if, for example, we're feeling an ability to fall off the ethical rail in one aspect of our life, chances are this will filter and affect other aspects of our ethical self. So that's why we contemplate on these questions. So it also turns out that the philosophers who had looked at this over a long time, okay, had two primary places that we could look at in order to see and become friends with our ethical selves. Okay, Marisa, we are on the shadow. Okay, so the first side, or the first to see, is the relationship between our head and our heart. Okay, so that is our cool rationality and our warm passion. As long as our head and our heart are in sync, we have a grand time. But what happens when they're out of sync? What is it that we feel when we are out of sync with our head and heart? Is often tension, or the dread of tension more often than not, then opposed to tension. It depends. It can go into direct tension or the dread of tension. But this is when we need to become aware of where we are likely to be directed if we do not have charge and control of who we are. So, for example, if I believe somebody has slighted me, do I take the route of justice and retribution, or do I show mercy? Now, if my whole world is falling apart, I have an option to use my rational self and hold people accountable, or do I go into a gentle and smooth flow in order to smooth the waters and preserve relationships? These are the dilemmas of everyday ethics, as opposed to just projecting my good self. My shadow self will become aware of this. So just like this, each one of us has a moral compass. Okay, we have an ongoing guide in terms of how we are supposed to be. Similarly, the communities in which we live and work in also have an expectation in terms of how they expect us to show up and remain members of good standing, if we are to remain members of good standing, that is. So as long as these morals are aligned to our subjective morals, all works well. But if there is misalignment of our morals as well as the morals of our communities, then this is where more often than not ethical tension is present. So if I believe I should be able to say anything to anyone at any time, whereas my community feels that I shouldn't, and I should rather keep my opinions to myself, there would be ethical tension. And this is often what we experience in everyday relationships as well as in work situations. So if, like me, but this is also an opportunity of where we are given in terms of self-reflection to understand our shadow and to start seeing our subjective thoughts and to start looking at our ethical decisions. Every time we feel tension is an opportunity to look at ethical decisions. So if, like me, you were taught that if you try to figure out principles of life and that if you work on it hard enough, you'll come up with answers. So I thought, until I started practicing this. And when I started practicing this, I found that there's many answers. We can move on to the next slide. We're still on shadow, but we are about to move on. So when I started practicing this, I found out that this is not necessarily the case because there are many answers. So it came down to understanding that as much as this is possible, that we can contemplate, it also depends. It depends on what we see, on how we interpret it, on how our subjectivity views situations, how we process information, how we were taught to process information. And largely, it is our own subjective experiences and interpretations that we bring from birth. So therefore, in terms of understanding our shadow side is dependent on who we perceive ourselves to be and the values that we have brought along with us. So there is a lot of contemplation and reflection in terms of understanding this. And also, it's not a side of ourselves that we should be ashamed of or should try to hide. Instead, it's something that we should become aware of. And if we aren't aware of this, of our shadow side, then this is something that more often than not takes over, especially in stressful situations. So on this point, take a minute to consider a recent situation in where you wanted to obtain something or get something more specifically from someone. Maybe you wanted to get a job promotion, or maybe it was a little bit more simpler than that. Maybe you wanted your partner or a family member to do the dishes. Or maybe you fancied someone and you wanted them to go on a date with you. Consider any of these situations or anything along those lines and contemplate, how did you get it done? How did you achieve that? Now, in an ideal situation, or in an ideal world, I should say, we would ask for what we want, and then people would comply. However, we know that this isn't necessarily so simple and clear-cut. It doesn't always work that way, or at least it often also doesn't work that way in the first try. Sometimes we do achieve it, but not necessarily on the first try. So on that point then, how do we get what we want? There are many approaches, and there are many ethical approaches. And often when we ask this question, we get the ethical responses in terms of how we get what we want. But rather, I want to focus on the unethical ways of how we get what we want. If we attempt to get what we want through anything other than ethics, it is deception. And deception includes anything that is lies or indirect tactics to get what we want. And often this is lumped under the word manipulation. Now, we all employ manipulation. We do it on a daily basis. We do it unknowingly, but we are doing it. We are also receiving manipulation without realizing it. So, oh, by the way, there are no sex differences with regards to manipulation. Research shows that manipulation tactics are used equally by males and females. So let's consider some of these. Everyday occurrences. Ask yourself these questions. Do you consider yourself to be charming? Have you considered or have you used your position of authority in any situation as leverage? Have you used your emotions to get someone to do something? Age group does not matter in that instance. Have you used your emotions to get someone to do something? How about do you use reason or logical arguments to get what you want? Or have you ever humbled yourself to get someone to agree with you or to forgive you? Have you found it yourself making it hard for someone to say no? Now, if you've answered yes to any of these questions, chances are, and of course based on context, but more often than not, we use these particular, I'm going to use behaviors or styles. I'm not going to use the word manipulation, but these are manipulation tactics. Now, whether you're receiving this or you are using this in your conversation or in your approaches, chances are you aren't aware that you're using manipulation tactics and therefore are employing this in your everyday behavior. There are actually 11 tactics in manipulation that we unknowingly use on a daily basis. Whether you're consciously or unconsciously manipulating or trying to manipulate, try and spot these signs for yourself so that you can become aware of your own approach as well as the approach that you are receiving from those who you are interacting with. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we see in front of us are all the various and obvious ways that occurs in our daily lives, things that we face that we aren't aware of. So for example, if we take charm, okay, we all know someone who uses a wink and a compliment to get what they want. That might even be you, and you might not be aware of how this is coming across and being perceived. People want to feel attractive and wanted. Okay. Manipulators play into these feelings. They feel that if someone starts to get a little flirty with them, they'll start to be attracted. And then the manipulator will be more likely to get their demands. Now, this is not a planned tactic, but it does occur. Coercion, for example, is another one. Now, coercion isn't a fun and flirty tactic. When someone is coercing, they are coercing someone into doing something. They may be using fear or harm. Now, the person being coerced might feel that the action of coercion is probably more important and necessary as opposed to not doing the action at all. They might feel fearful and therefore follow through. One that we all hate, and one that gets my gut for sure, and I've had to employ a lot of work in myself in order to overcome, is silent treatment. Now, silent treatment is surprisingly an effective manipulation tactic, but it is also a negotiation tool. So this, like many of these tactics that we see in front of us, aren't all just manipulation, but are mainly used in manipulation. So silent treatment makes us anxious. If someone is silent or refusing to speak, we may give in just to break the silence, but that is manipulation and unethical. Or for that matter, let's look at reason. I would have never thought reason would have fallen in this category, but it does. Now, not all manipulation tactics are unethical, and reason is also one of these. It's a great example of a manipulation tactic. People use reason or logical arguments to get what they want. Okay, they might say something like, if you help me do this, then, as an example. It might be hard to argue against someone who uses reason or manipulation. You may feel more likely to break down and give in to reason. So again, it's something that you will have to discern for yourself, or if you are using reason, look at the ways you're using reason and potentially maybe using reason as a control tactic as opposed to reason. The underlying feeling might be control, and that in itself is unethical. Then we have regression. Okay, when two people reason with each other like adults and have understanding, it's easy for both parties to hold their ground and have a conversation. But if one person in that dynamic starts behaving unreasonably, and what is often referred to as a child, and when we refer to as a child, what we're normally referring to is the uncontrolled emotion of a child, or someone that cannot understand logic or cannot easily be calmed down, then things might go haywire. This regression tactic may result in someone, you might see them whining, pouting, and use emotions as well. And then we give into this tactic, believing that we have placated the situation or overcome it, but it is actually an unethical act on our side if we do this as well in such a dynamic. Then you have something called self-abasement. Now, again, not all manipulation tactics involve insulting or forcing other people to do something. If a manipulator uses self-abasement to get what they want, here they humble themselves. They humble themselves to either be forgiven or to get someone to do what they want, or for that matter, they might believe that strengthening a certain relationship might be in their favor. So they will humble themselves. In other ways, they will be slightly deceptive, because that is not necessarily who they truly are. So if you are aware of this in terms of where you do this in certain dynamics of yourself, or you see it in relationships, be aware of this, because this can infiltrate other dynamics in your life where you find that your decision making is actually affected by this particular behavior. One that I found quite interesting and wouldn't have also thought about is called responsibility invocation. With responsibility invocation, let's say you plan on meeting up with a friend, and on the day of the meeting, the day you don't feel like it, or you're not up to it, or something happens and you just aren't able to make the meeting, or you just plain not feeling well and can't get to it. With responsibility invocation, what happens is the person makes it difficult for you to say no. So you will find things like people saying to you, but you promised, or I've already made a reservation, or if you don't do this, this is the implication. Now, this might be the case, but it does not necessarily take your feelings into consideration or your real also your real situation. So responsibility invocation is a difficult one, but be aware of it because it does happen very often, and we don't see the signs of someone pushing us into a corner to be able to be ourselves and stand up for what is right for us. So if you're finding that you're giving people very little room to say no, or yourself aren't able to say no, then that might be something you're facing. Hardball on the other side is very different. Now this takes coercion into a completely different level, a much higher level. While someone in coercion uses or instills fear, I should say, hardball actually causes harm or bodily injury. Now, this happens mainly in social situations. Very rarely do we see this in corporate situations, but we do see it in personal situations and social situations. Then we also have pleasure induction. Now, pleasure induction is a very harmless manipulation tactic. When someone invokes pleasure induction tactic, what they're simply doing here is telling you that if you don't do it, or if you do it, for example, they convince you that you will have fun. They'll convince you that it will be right for you. Now, if you're finding yourself in such a situation where you feel that there is pleasure induction, what you need to do here is stop and ask yourself, is this really what I want to be doing? Does this sound like something that I'm going to get value or give value from? This is also a very slippery one and a difficult one to discern. Then we have social comparison, big one and a common one. With social comparison theory, we describe ourselves in terms of comparison to others. So be aware of speech that you're listening to and speech that you're using in this instance. So people measure their success or their attractiveness or presence of personality through the traits of other people. Now, manipulators in this instance know this tendency very well. So they will use this in reverse to convince you that that is how they see you. So be aware in terms of social comparison. Also, in social comparison, there'll be lots of references to other people, often in the case of, for example, leaders, socialites, movie stars, that type of thing, always trying to make you feel lesser than or compare you to strive up to somebody and something else, as opposed to use your own abilities and skills to motivate you. And then we have what is called monetary reward. Big one as well, where a person plays into greed by offering money and to commit acts that one would not commit. Now, depending again on social settings and environments, we find that monetary reward does play a big role in terms of manipulation tactics, and can actually be something that you might think you are not necessarily prone to. But again, I would caution you, monetary reward can creep up depending on stages of our lives or depending on where we find ourselves. So be aware of some of these tactics in yourself. Everyday manipulation tactics, we cannot avoid them, whether we are actually bringing them to the conversations or we are receiving them from conversations. Next slide, please, Marisa. So then we have some philosophical conversation that underpins all of this. As I said, these conversations have been carrying on for over 5,000 years. Okay, philosophers talked a lot about what are the varied opinions are on how to live a good life. Now, this evolved into the following opinions. The first opinion was what is called deontology, or also known as duties are right. Now, in this instance, they said, if individuals use their head to figure out principles of their lives, they will know what to do. Whilst others said, what you need to do is search your heart to find out the desires that are important to you. If you do this, then you'll know how to live. Whilst others still said that the individuals, as a member of the community, need to use their reason and look around their communities to see where justice needs to take place. In this way, they will know what needs to be done in order to ensure that everyone in the community is cared for. Then there was another school of thought. Okay, the fourth school of thought was called virtue ethics. Now, in virtue ethics, here they said, search your heart, see what counts for excellence, and then execute your plan. Now, just from these 4 different principles, you can see that one can be so easily confused. What's a person to do in such a situation? There are 4 different theories, 4 different approaches to ethics, and we have our own subjective values. Well, luckily, it turns out that all of these are right, and yet at the same time, they all can be wrong. The reason is that you and I, we individually get to bring the best of these 4 theories into our own lives and into every specific situation that we find ourselves placed in. Now, research has also shown us that as individuals, we have a preference of what is our personal ethical style. Or from what our philosophers have given us, that it is more likely that we have a blend of 2 styles. We have a predominant style, and then we have a blend of another style that we may use. So it is important for you to become aware of yourself, as we said, know who you are, know how you make decisions, and then be aware of the different styles and see which style speaks to your personality style. So if we have to look, the first way to do this is to clarify your intention by asking yourselves some questions to seek the truth of who you are. And one of the first ways of doing that is to ask yourself, what is it that I really want? In every situation that you find yourself in, you should be asking yourself, if not consciously and aware, you should be unconsciously asking yourself, what is it that I want from this particular instance or situation? Why am I involved in this? Why do you want it? What are you trying to accomplish? What is making this choice going to mean to you in your immediate sense, short term, and in the bigger picture? What is your motivation behind your action or your decision? How are you using your resources, including your power, in that particular instance? And how can you use it fairly? What kind of character are you developing in that moment? And what kind of character do you want to develop and be known for? When we start asking these questions, which are slightly difficult questions, more than ones that we need to contemplate on, we can start seeking the truth of who we are. It is only when we do this that we can learn to start caring about ourselves, the impact that we have on the bigger world, and therefore the impact that our decisions have on other things and people outside of ourselves. So again, our philosophical friends has given us some guidance in terms of how we treat others, because often we don't think about how we treat others, but we just act. One of the ways we can do that is ask yourself, are you treating others as they want to be treated? Or are you treating others as you think they want to be treated, or you think that they expect to be treated? How do you treat others and at the same time allow them to make their own choices, get their own meaning of life, and follow their own path whilst you remain on your ethical path? Now, this is often a difficult one in intimate relationships as well as parent-child relationships. So that's a big question that comes in with communities. Again, how do you care for people with no power? If you're overseeing a community or you're overseeing a group of people and you are empowered to make decisions on their behalf, or you're empowered to guide them and lead them, how do you make decisions or guide a group in order to make decisions, to model themselves to make future ethical decisions? These are big decisions that we need to ask ourselves, that is based on all these philosophical theories. So knowing the philosophical theories and how they land in our lives is one thing, but how we actually execute and implement them comes in the forms of the questions that I've been asking. Next slide, please, Marisa. When we're talking about ethics, often we come to the point of right versus wrong. What might be perceived right to me versus what might be perceived right to you. Now, ethical misconduct is the mainstay of the news currently and has been for many years. We're all aware of CEOs raiding corporate coffers, widespread auditing fraud throughout the world, unbridled cheating, not just necessarily in corporates, but in schools and universities, professional doctoring of data, reporters lying. We are not sure of what we can and cannot trust. What is the sources of facts? And in terms of our own landscape and across the world, well, politicians are being politicians. So the incidence and variety of transgressions seem interminable. Interminable. If we look at any one of this today in our life as we sit here and listen to this right now, there isn't a single thing that I've just pointed out that we can say that we can completely trust. We can't look at anything at face value without having to go further into it to understand the source and trust it. That is the landscape of what we are dealing with at the moment. So when we face these ethical dilemmas on a day-to-day basis, we have to understand what is the right thing to do. We have to understand what is the difference between right and wrong. And this is often a subjective thing, as your understanding and upbringing is different from mine. So we might have to have some conversations on that. At this point, you must be wondering, isn't just wrongdoing a normal human condition, and that is how we learn? You might even be wondering, can you really change your own beliefs and behavior as an adult? Or for that matter, can we even bother to teach, and can we really, truly, effectively teach children how to be ethical? Now, these are all real considerations. But if we are to form some sort of idea or direction in pursuing this, we have got to start with ourselves. Now, these are very difficult questions, but they're not rhetorical questions. So to address them, we have to go back into understanding everyday ethics as well. So ask yourself some of these questions in terms of how you would respond. A common one, the ATM spits out an extra 100 Rand in your favor. Do you keep the money and keep quiet? At a restaurant, you notice your friend's partner engaged in some serious flirting. Do you tell a friend and possibly ruin that relationship, or do you mind your own business? You have the opportunity to avail yourself of free wireless connection from your neighbor. Seems silly not to do this. Do you do it? Your colleague is forever taking credit for your work. Is it okay to extract a little revenge and for once take credit for their work? Your friend is on her way out to an important date. She asks you how she looks. Do you tell her that her blouse is hideous? How about sexist jokes? Do you laugh at sexist jokes? And you have access to insider information that you can use to your advantage that benefits you and your family. Do you use it? You see, we face choices like these daily, morally laden quandaries that demand our direct and immediate decision. Now, unlike moral conversations that dominate our dinner conversations, which we do very little about other than pontificate, the problem of everyday ethics calls for our resolution, calls for an understanding of how we arrive at our judgments. So, for example, when you contemplated these questions that I just raised, did you have a quick, intuitive response about what was proper? Or did you consider broader moral principles and then derive a solution? Embracing the moral importance of these ordinary dilemmas has positioned us from a bottom-up perspective of these ethical decisions. They're mundane but necessary in order for us to address because they inform our bigger decisions, especially when we are placed in stressful situations. Now, accordingly, because these traditional moral theories can't reach down to our routine, everyday, mundane lives, we should question the practical value. So take, for example, the demand for impartiality. The notion that is common to many moral theories that says that we should treat everyone the same. But of course, we know that it is impossible and we do not treat everyone the same, nor should we. So if we don't appeal to our moral principles when deciding on how to address problems of everyday ethics, then how do we make these decisions? The one way is at the onset is to recognize and take seriously the difficulties inherent in these judgments and to cut yourself some slack for that. It's interesting that the ethical questions aren't those of the choice between good and evil. That's easy. Or for that matter, right and wrong, somewhat easier. But it is more what is good versus absolutely the right answer versus what is bad and worse. The situations vary along that spectrum. So take, for example, the situation where our friend was leaving and asked for our opinion. She was leaving on that crucial date and asked for our opinion on how she looked. Do you tell her the truth? Honesty demands that you tell her the truth. But compassion urges you to give her the thumbs up. Is it worth noticing that other values, say friendship in this instance? Where does that fall in the spectrum? Surely it should count. But how? Therefore, in this instance, one ought to be more truthful to a friend than a stranger. But then too, how do you do that? Because shouldn't we necessarily be more encouraging to a friend? So as you can see, appealing to clear-cut moral principles such as do unto others as you would have them do unto you isn't necessarily decisive here. Or for example, in other situations. Because presumably people might have different answers depending on their subjectivity. We can, however, nonetheless draw a few lessons from these considerations. So, firstly, we need to be clear about which values are at play and which values are more important and most important to us. Now, in such instances, we won't necessarily always have the luxury of a long timeline or careful consideration in terms of understanding competing principles of our actions. But this is a requirement. Secondly, our intellectual honesty is also something that we need to consider here. So, for example, with regards to lying, we need to acknowledge how easy it is for us to justify dishonesty by claiming compassion or, for example, some other good intent, when in fact all we're really trying to do in such instances is avoid unpleasant confrontations. We all do it. The difference is to become aware of it in ourselves and to change those behaviors about ourselves. Then thirdly, we need to cut ourselves some slack as well as cut other people some slack. Now, in as much as the problems posed by everyday ethics are genuine dilemmas, and they don't necessarily allow the luxury of lengthy, careful analysis, there are instances when decent people do come up with decent reasons for doing what they did. So in this instance, the reason we are mentioning this is that every situation needs to be evaluated and considered in terms of context. So that's what we talk about, cutting some slack. So if this is a situation, we're constantly questioning, we're considering everyone else, we're looking at ourselves, how then do we make quick judgments in terms of everyday ethics and moral situations? How do we contemplate what's going on in our mind in split seconds? One way of doing this is consider, for example, what has been often used, and you may have come across this previously, so bear with me if you have, and if you haven't, indulge me. It's called the thought experiment posed by moral philosophers, excuse my pronunciation, I've got a teeth work happening at the moment, so that's why my speech is going a bit awry here. It's the trolley car situation. You may have come across this, but play along with me. Suppose you are the driver of a runaway trolley car. This trolley car is approaching 5 men working on the track. Now, as this trolley car is speeding down, approaching this tragedy, you realize as the conductor that you can divert this train to a side of the track where it would only kill 1 person as opposed to the 5 that are on the track that it is heading towards. What do? You're the conductor, you make the decision. Do you kill 5 people or do you kill 1? Now consider another situation. Suppose you aren't the train conductor, but here you're standing on a cliff, watching the train careen towards this same tragedy. But as it approaches the endangered 5 people, next to you is standing a very heavy, large person. Now you're aware that if you bump this person over, the sheer body weight will stop the trolley and prevent the death of these 5 people. But in this instance, you will again only kill 1 person. What would you do? You don't necessarily have to give me your answer, but consider which one, in which instance, what decision you would make. What we found in this particular experiment is that most people say that they would save the 5 lives in case 1, but not in case 2. Also offer many complicated reasons as to why they would do this. But what research shows is that when we are placed in such situations, different parts of our brain come into play. In the first instance, the area associated with emotions is highlighted. And the second areas remain quiet because the first instance, the area of emotions are quiet because we're calculating, whereas in the second instance, we are speaking mostly to emotion. So we are unlikely to push the person over because that is resulting in a choice of death. Now, this becomes very difficult because we won't necessarily choose to kill someone, but we will choose to redirect that trolley in terms of killing 1 person, although we are not directly involved. So this is considerations that show how our brain highlights our parts of our brain is highlighted when we are placed in stressful situations. The digital ethics slide, please, Marisa. So I'm just going to go quickly through digital ethics as I see that we are running out of time. Now, with digital ethics, what I would like for us to be aware of here is when we talk about ethics, or as we have been talking about ethics for the last couple of thousand years, digital ethics has only come along in the last couple of years. With the rapid development, especially with regards to artificial intelligence, we need to be aware of the breakthroughs and how they influence our life. So, for example, are you aware of your direct engagement and the implications of artificial intelligence or digital? It's in terms of how you engage, your responsibilities, what you can and cannot do, and the implications, as well as what digital ethics infiltration means in your life. So, for example, AI is actually created by humans. Okay, we are aware of that. But are you aware that AI is susceptible to bias? It's a bias that results from the developers. It's called systematic biases that are input into the developments of the various apps that we are using. If you aren't aware of this, if you, for example, it occurs when there's machine learning happening. The data is trained in a certain stance or a certain direction, and these are input from developers. So we've got to be aware of biases that come in. Now, the media is also using what is called algorithmic news recommenders, also known as ANR. So those feeds that you see constantly coming up on your social media, if you, whatever platforms you're looking at, you see the same adverts or same conversations, whatever your interest is. If you are aware of this, and if you're using social media and using digital technology, be aware of this, because there is ethical bias in this. What this means is that particular content is being customized and directed to you and to your news stories. However, what this is also doing is that it's preventing you as a viewer from expanding what you view. It's preventing your choices. It's limiting your worldview. It's limiting your thought processes as well. So if you are indulging in such applications, it does not matter on what form, be aware of how you are indulging in ethics, because every time you accepting a terms and conditions or downloading a new app, are you aware of all the ethical considerations that have been input into that and the implications that it has on your life as well as on the broader spectrum? Because all initiatives are meant to adhere to fundamental human rights, such as human dignity and security, privacy, etc. However, we are aware that digital data is being sold. We are aware that information infiltrates beyond where we have given permission. So digital ethics is now another form of ethics that we need to be aware of. Marisa, I see that we are running out of time.
Yes, I think we can go. I'm actually, as I'm sitting here, I'm absolutely lost for words. I'm gonna have to go and re-listen to this over and over and over again.
Cool. So thank you for that. I just want to say before I leave, just please be aware that ethics is not legal. So the question is ethics legal? No. Ethics and legal are very, very different spheres, okay? So be aware that there can be crossovers, but legal does not necessarily have to be ethical.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Resheka. It is, like I said, I have a lot to think about now. And I always thought, ethics comes to these big decisions and the big things you have to do in life. But it opened my eyes this morning to see you have to start from the bottom and think about the smaller things and then build up your resilience, if I can call it that.
Totally. It's the same as learning to walk. We had to take those first steps to build the strength and a muscle. And the same with ethics. It doesn't end. And our world evolves and changes, and so do we as people, which means it's a continuously evolving conversation.
No, I think you've given us quite a bit to think about and look at. So, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry, we went a little bit over time, but I'm sure you will forgive us. So, guys, in the chat box and at the bottom, you will see we did load a link to forms. So please complete that for us. And this is then a test of ethics. Don't complete the form if you did not watch the webinar. So there we go. There's a test for everyone. I will keep it open until 5 because I know a lot of you need to run for meetings. But otherwise, after this, as soon as the recording is posted, I will put up a new form to just answer some questions so we can confirm that you've watched it. So guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day further. And Resheka, thank you as always.
My pleasure. And thank you, everyone. And apologies again for last week.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Okay, cheers. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.